Good evening, my friends. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can be with you forever. Today I'm going to be talking about a very popular subject that is kind of just in the forefront of a lot of people's mindset and just the general narrative that circles a lot of people's views on things and how they conduct themselves in lives, very politically inclined, and that's empathy. And empathy has become a very big talking point in terms of people who are either lacking in empathy or people who consider themselves empaths and like to sort of celebrate themselves for being empathetic. And what I kind of want to talk about is obviously from the title of this video, I'm going to be kind of critical towards empathy. But first, I just kind of want to talk about what this word even actually means and what it attempts to accomplish, and how I think it's really not that meritable as a quality to have, specifically because it's just a basic human function. Most people are empathetic, at least to some degree, towards other human beings or even just animals. And this is basically a basic tenet of psychopathy or sociopathy, is people who just don't have the capacity for empathy or to connect with other people on an emotional level. And I want to emphasize the context of an emotional level because I think there are many different ways we connect with other people. It doesn't necessarily have to just be emotional. And I think this is where empathy starts to become twisted around in a context that is not necessarily in people's best interests, and both for themselves and for others, mainly other people, which I'll get into. And I think the emotional context needs to be understood, because really what empathy is the emotional connection that you feel. You're feeling the same emotional response as another person. And one of the easiest ways people do this to be able to relate with another is to find a basic underlying agreement, let's just say, of an emotional understanding that another person might have felt at another time or point in their life that they can understand. So when another person, usually what people identify with the most emotionally, especially if they call themselves an empath, is usually some sort of trauma, some sort of difficulty in their lives, some sort of suffering, which is very easy to be empathetic towards because everyone has felt like shit at some point or another. And if another person feels like shit, it's like, oh, I know how you feel. And you are instigating some kind of memory, some kind of synapse, some kind of connection to what suffering or pain is, or that same sensory response that is at least similar to another person to where you can empathize with them. And this is just a basic thing that humans can do to understand each other. When someone's describing an emotional experience, that triggers an emotional response in the person listening, and then they're like, oh, I know how you feel, because I'm feeling it right now, right? So a lot of people do this, and then they sort of celebrate themselves, which I find very, I'm just going to say it's perverse that people celebrate these things, because I don't think it's something to celebrate. I don't think it's something to be ashamed of necessarily, but it's just a thing that exists. It's like feeling sadness, feeling happiness. You don't need to celebrate the fact that you're experiencing an emotional response. It's there. So how do you use that, right? And this is where the empathy conversation becomes very problematic, because ultimately people experience this empathetic response and then they immediately want to respond in some way. And this is where the negativity starts coming in. And the negativity that I'm talking about is people acting upon an emotional response, right? Which we can see logically it doesn't necessarily factor into the person's best interests. So a perfect example is, you're at a bar and someone spills a drink on you and you get pissed off and angry and then you act irrationally afterwards because someone spilled a drink on you and you get into a fight with someone because they messed with your shirt and your shirt's really expensive, let's say, and you're just pissed off. So that's an emotional response. So if you're an empath or whatever, a normal human being, and you hear about something that affects other people or some other person's telling a story about something, and you get this emotional response on behalf of another person, let's just say it's anger, you will start to feel angry in that moment, right? And generally, when you are angry, you are not thinking things rationally and logically. You're not thinking in an objective manner. And this is where this concept of empathy that people are very indulgent with, I find. A lot of people are very indulgent with the concept of being empathetic towards other people, and they sort of want to experience this emotional response. They think it's a good thing to act on anger for another person when you can just sort of recognize the aspect of empathy. And yeah, you can understand the feeling that someone's going through, which I think is more valuable, is understanding it from an objective standpoint. But if you're just experiencing the emotional response on behalf of the other person, you're taking objectivity and logic out of your mind and choosing to move forward in an emotional way, in an emotional response. And then you start making decisions for those people based off of an emotional response. And we can see the long-term effects of this and how this impacts people because of these emotional responses that people have, which are very empathetic, right? So you look at politics, and I'm not going to get into specifics because I don't want to make this into a political rant because I don't want to get my own personal views specifically into this because it's not really the point of this video. But my point is, it's like regardless of what political stance you have, there is a degree of empathy if you are politically inclined, because politics involves large groups of people. So you're feeling an empathetic attachment towards people that you relate with, or you receive the same emotional response that other people like you have. And this is kind of where political identity starts being constructed, and where you get people who have similar issues, similar problems, being empathetic with each other, starting to make decisions. And you start to see people making decisions based off of an emotional response, but because it's empathetic in the context of, oh, I'm feeling the same emotions of these people that are suffering, all of a sudden, regardless of what you do or your actions that you choose to take, regardless of if they even harm the person that you're trying to help even more, you still regard it as an inherent good because you are empathetic. And this is where the problem of empathy comes from, because it's not a good or a bad thing, it just exists. And how you use that is what's really important. And generally, I don't necessarily think being empathetic is good all the time. I think after a certain stage, you should try to let go of empathy, because you can't think objectively if you have a constant emotional response to certain problems that people are experiencing. And if you can't think objectively, you cannot think in a way that actually helps people. And a lot of people, because they have this emotional response, they feel this urgent need, this desire to help other people, to help people that are in situations, and they end up making the problems a lot worse. This is a huge problem with empathy. And it also, there's also another aspect of empathy where people are only empathetic towards people that they connect with, that they relate with, right? And that's sort of like something that I've noticed, is people are only empathetic towards people who are just like them, pretty much, which is very easy to do. If someone has experienced the same thing you have, you will immediately feel a lot more empathy than towards someone who hasn't experienced anything that you have, experienced a completely different perspective of things. Let's say you take a victim and oppressor situation. It's much easier to be empathetic towards a victim because everyone's been a victim at some point, and everyone can acknowledge being a victim and knowing what that feels like. It's very easy to do that. Just take any situation in your life where someone has been mean to you. I yet to meet someone who has never had an experience where they were victimized, at least in some way. So it's very easy to empathize with someone if you have that capacity to do so, which I guess some people don't. But yeah, if you can do that, that's easy. But there's also another context of being empathetic towards an oppressor, which a lot of people can't do because they've never been in that situation necessarily. And so because of that, they look at this other person as as a different aspect of themselves, because they can't empathize with that person because they've never experienced what that person has experienced or understood them. And this is where empathy becomes a block. It becomes a wall of your ability to actually connect with people and to have compassion. And I think this is where compassion and empathy need to kind of separate, so we can understand both of these things, so we can understand what the function is, because empathy realistically is only an emotional response to someone else's emotions that you have experienced before and you can relate to. So when you talk about compassion, the compassion aspect, which really was a very novel idea, let's say, and like 2,000 years ago, and the concept of being compassionate is to see yourself in every single other person around you and to understand other people in a way that's objective so that you can help them in the best way possible. And unfortunately, for a lot of people's situations and a lot of problems, the best thing that you can do if you feel an emotional response a lot of the times is to do nothing or to do very minimal action in the situation, which is actually one of the hardest things for people to do. It's easy to do nothing and just put it out of your mind and go about your day. And then it's also kind of easy to just impose yourself onto other people because you feel this urgent need to help someone because you're empathetic or whatever. But it's very difficult to sort of take a step back and do something that's very minor and to be sort of separate from it, separate yourself from it, which I think a lot of people don't do because they want to feel connected. They want to feel that emotional connection to other people. And sure, that there is that bond of emotional connection that you can create. But if you genuinely want to help someone, this is when you have to take a step back from the emotions, because the emotions don't know shit about the real world or what this person needs. And the person doesn't even know what they need in the context of their emotional response. All they know is the emotion. This feels bad. So when you think about how do you rectify the situation, this is when you actually need to think logically. And sometimes the logical, rational answer is something that sounds like it's not good. Like you shouldn't do that because you get this emotional connection to this other thing. And this is where you get into the whole political debate aspect of things. But yeah, so basically what what people consider empathy to be this inherent good that everyone needs to understand, you notice that a lot of the times it's a very selfish, indulgent experience that people have when it comes to empathy, because really all they care about is their own emotional response that they want to eliminate because they feel bad for another person. So they feel like they need to take action in an emotional context to help these people, which may or may not help. You don't really know because you're acting off of emotion. You're not acting off of objectivity, which is where the real problems start to happen. And let's take a perfect example of, I'm not going to get into capitalism or communism because it's too, whatever. Let's talk about Christianity, right? And, as someone who is religious, as a Jew, I respect a lot of what Christianity brought and what Christianity has done for people. But you also need to understand that there's a lot of problems that it has, especially with missionaries forcing people to convert to Christianity, right? That was a huge problem during the Crusades, during the Spanish Inquisition. But all of this was done out of empathy. All of these people did these things because they genuinely cared about people's well-being. They wanted people to embrace the truth of Christ. And yeah, Christianity is true in a way. There is a truth to it that they feel compelled to share to the world. And it's an emotional thing. It's an emotional response because they feel so much connection and compassion for everyone or whatever. This emotional response of Jesus being able to empathize with the whole world. But they experience it only in an emotional context. They don't experience it spiritually necessarily. That does exist, but most of the time it's emotional. and then they act upon emotion. And if someone's rejecting their ideas, it's like, no, that's stupid. I don't get this Jesus stuff. They get angry because all of a sudden they're rejecting this aspect of themselves that they feel like is in everyone around them. So if you're not the same as everyone else, like me, like I'm compassionate for every single person, but you're not. You don't get that. You don't understand that thing. So I can't empathize with you anymore. So I hate you and I don't like you. You're not human, right? This is the kind of mentality that happens, and this is happening now with a lot of people who claim to be empathetic towards groups of people, but then they hate another group of people. That's not compassion. That's not understanding. That's just an emotional response of empathy for people that you connect with the same emotional response. It's very easy to do that, like I've said, but a lot of people can't understand things that are outside of their own experience. And this is where objectivity, spirituality in a genuine context becomes more relevant, because the aspect of empathy, the emotional aspect, which is egotistical, it's not who you are genuinely, consciously, objectively. If you think about consciousness that everyone can relate with, it's purely an empathetic segregation from someone else, right? And if someone else is not like you, then you either hate them or you enforce an idea down their throat until they relate with you. And if they don't relate with you, then you dehumanize them, because the logic of your mind, of your emotional mind, feels like I need to empathize with everyone, which is the problem of Christianity as a religion, was this incessant need for everyone to have the same ideas and the same level of compassion and empathy towards everyone and have the same ideas. And if you didn't follow under that, then you weren't worthy of having empathy or care towards necessarily, or people will care about you, but only in the context of if you accept Jesus into your life, because they're afraid that that person's soul will be damned, and they feel the pain and they don't want that person to experience that, but then they get angry when the person doesn't. It just becomes this twisted emotional response to something where you can't think objectively, you can't understand the person and understand what's best for that person. Forcing people to convert objectively did not work. So, but people still did it anyway, because all they did was operate based off of an emotional response, which is what a lot of people do. They see someone they don't like, and instead of trying to understand why that happened, they immediately respond with the emotional thing because of how they feel, or how they'll extend it to other people like them who feel the same thing, and they're like, what? They're so selfish. Don't they care about these people that I care about? And it's that kind of weird psychotic mentality. And I'll say psychotic because it's not founded in compassion. It's not founded in understanding other people. Even if they are wrong, you still need to understand it from an objective standpoint. If all you're doing is just trying to understand things from an emotional standpoint, you're not going to get very far. I think a lot of people idolize emotions in this current age, which I don't really know why. Emotions aren't necessarily helpful in any regard. They kind of restrict people from actually being able to understand things objectively and see the world as it is and have a profound experience of contentment. Because they're chasing emotional experience. They want to feel joy and excitement and all this other stuff. And usually a lot of these people who chase those emotional thrills have bipolar disorders, not medically prescribed to them necessarily, but they experience that high point and that low point, right? Where they feel this immense joy for one thing, and then the next day something pisses them off for whatever reason, whatever their lives go through, because life isn't exactly just amazing and perfect. So things happen that they don't like, and then they have that emotional response because they're living in an emotional experience in their lives. So that's a problem, because you shouldn't have to go through life and have your emotions dictate who you are. And a lot of people feel like this incessant need to experience life on an emotional level, and they experience empathy on an emotional level, and they think so highly of this experience when really it's a distortion, and it's only just a reflection of your own emotional response that someone else has expressed that's reminding you of your own emotions, to reflect back. And so you understand it on that concept on an emotional level. But when it comes to genuine, compassionate understanding, that comes from being able to see the person objectively. You're not judging the person. You're not trying to empathize with the person or try to feel the same emotions that you're feeling. You're just observing and taking it in. And that's it. You're not trying to fix them or do anything. You're not imposing yourself. You're just objectively experiencing it. And I think it's fair to help people as much as you can, but you shouldn't try to help people. I think this is where the problem comes, where people try to help and then they fail. Well, it's like, yeah, because you're trying. You shouldn't try to help. You should just do the right thing. It's pretty simple. When you see things objectively, you don't have to try to do anything anymore. You're just doing it because you're living. You're just seeing things objectively. Someone's doing something wrong, you look at it objectively, and if you don't know how to fix the problem, you'd be like, all right, well, I can't get involved with this because I don't want to fuck anything up. And a lot of people don't have the honesty to do that because all they care about is the empathetic response, and they feel an emotion and they feel like, I need to do something. Something must be done. And a lot of young people are like that. They feel this emotional response, this strong empathetic feeling, but they don't know shit. They don't know anything about how the world works. They attach themselves to this political ideology, which is shaky to begin with because there is no perfect ideology. They've all failed, but they attach themselves anyway because they need a solution now, because they're impatient. They don't know what the solution is. And since they don't know the solution, they'll act upon their emotions. And since young people, including myself, I don't want to big myself up like as if I'm above all emotional responses. I have the same problems like anyone else would. I get emotional and get angry and get upset on behalf of other people or just for myself. And that's an empathetic response that I'm guilty of, but at least I am aware of when that happens, and I can reflect later and be like, you know what, I was kind of over the top here. I was being too aggressive here. I was being too emotional, what have you. And but a lot of young people do this, but they don't have that cognitive awareness to see that I'm reacting completely on an emotional level, and it's not helping people, because being emotional doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help yourself. It doesn't help other people. All it does is you feel something. It's just a sensory experience that's happening. And then the real help to do is to come up with an objective reasoning, an objective plan to figure out what to do. And if you don't know how to do it properly, or if you're emotionally attached to an idea because you insist that it must work, then you're not helping anyone. And which is the problem. People become attached to things emotionally because they want to fix this problem, and then they emotionally attach to the system because they don't really know the answers, so they find some other answer through some ideological principle. They follow that principle, and instead of acknowledging that, hey, maybe this doesn't work, or they question it, maybe they just follow it because if there's anything that challenges the idea that this works, then they're basically helpless and they can't do anything, which just exacerbates the emotional response, and the emotional response becomes useless at that point. So they have to force themselves to engage in this political ideology and enforce it no matter what, because they're emotionally attached to it, and they have no desire to take a step back from their emotions and be like, okay, does this actually work? Does this actually help people? Or is this actually just making things worse? And a lot of the times when it does get worse, people will not acknowledge that it's getting worse because they're not thinking from a standpoint of rationality. They're not thinking objectively. It's completely emotional. It's a complete emotional response. And that's all they really care about is to satisfy the emotional response. I'm angry. I want to get rid of this anger. And the only way to get rid of this anger is to help someone. What if the way to help someone goes against your ideology that you've attached yourself to? What are you going to do at that point? Well, you can't, because you're emotionally attached to it. Unless you detach from your emotions and see things objectively and realize that you don't know shit, then you can actually take time and patience to learn about things, to help people. And sometimes you'll never figure it out. You'll never be able to help someone. Some people, they're beyond help. And a lot of people can't just accept that because they're not thinking objectively. They're thinking emotionally. And they're just constantly attached to the emotion, which is entirely dependent off circumstance, right? Emotions are entirely dependent off circumstance. When you detach from your emotions, circumstance doesn't really matter. Whatever happens to you, you can maintain a level of objectivity where your emotions aren't getting in the way. Whether you're happy, whether you're sad, you're still taking a step back and seeing things objectively without becoming too attached to them, right? Which is why when you look at things in like Eastern philosophy, which sort of on a very basic westernized level promotes empathy and compassion in an emotional sense, which is very kind of watered down versions of these beliefs, because realistically they kind of detached from any emotion, and that includes joy and happiness and things like that, because those things aren't conducive towards your spiritual development, your objective faculties. It doesn't help you in any way. It's just an experience that's, and like I said, it's not good or bad. It's just, it is part of being human. But if you are in a position, especially a position of power, political power, you're in a position where you're financially superior to people. I don't want to say superior, financially higher. I don't know, you have a lot of money. If you're in a position like that and you start making decisions on behalf of other people that do not have those same leverages of power, and you're doing it from a standpoint of emotional responses, and you're just attached to that emotional responses, you may cause a lot of damage. And a lot of people are doing that right now, and it's causing a lot of problems for people. And they don't want to take accountability because, well, it's coming from a good place, because I'm empathetic. I empathize with these people I care so much about. And then you just end up making the situation worse because you fail to acknowledge that your empathy is part of the problem. And you need to get rid of your empathy to actually look at this situation objectively and see, what can I actually do literally to help these people without getting myself involved emotionally? What's the best course of action here? And there's another aspect of empathy too. Like if you have an animal that's, has a broken leg or it's injured, right, and you want to alleviate its suffering as much as possible, you put it down. You put down the animal. That's the logical thing to do because it's in pain. It's going to die anyway. So you want to do it in the most painless way possible. So a lot of people choose to do that because it's an objective thing that just makes sense. And realistically, even though a lot of people love their pets and love their animals, it's a lot easier to make decisions off of animals because you can think objectively, because it's not another human being. Because other human beings, it's a lot easier to connect with empathetically because you just relate to them on a more personal level. So that's why you can look at a dog and be like, all right, I got to put him down. But are you going to be the same way towards your parents or anything like that? It's very hard to think objectively when it comes to those deep emotional connections. So obviously, you can't really expect people when it comes to personal relationships to think of things objectively when there's an emotional response that's very, very intense. Pulling the plug on someone who's in a coma, that's a very difficult decision for someone to make, but you have to do it from a standpoint of being objective. What's the best case scenario for this person? Is it realistic to keep them on a machine, to keep them alive, or is it best to just let them go, let them die? And that's kind of a real tricky question, but this is where empathy and objectivity start having a battle, because emotionally you want to keep them alive, to keep them in your life, to keep them there. But you realize that's actually a selfish desire, because realistically, you know, truthfully, that the best case scenario for them is to, let's say, pull the plug necessarily. But this is a very specific example that I'm bringing up. But it's one of those things you have to think about. What's objectively the best choice to make for this person? And a lot of people don't do that for things that they aren't even connected with on a personal level. Like, you'll have people have such strong emotional responses towards groups of people that they don't even know. They've never met them. They don't even interact with these people whatsoever. And they think they know, based off of an emotional response, what's best for them. And they make decisions from a top-down point of view of what's best for these people. And they do it from a standpoint of empathy and compassion and a love for people. But really, it's just emotional. And it's not objective, because they just want to experience the emotion that, oh, I'm angry now, but if I help them, I'll feel good. I'll feel happy. I'll feel good about myself. And they feel this incessant need to feel good, to feel joy for helping someone. It's like a drug. And if they can't achieve that goal, then all that does is exacerbate the emotional response beforehand, the negative one. Let's say it's anger, and then the anger just festers and grows, and they say, why isn't this working? It has to work. These people, like, let's go back to the Christianity examples. Like, why won't these people accept Christ? What's wrong with them? We gotta torture them. We gotta force them into them, because if they don't do this, I won't be able to feel good about myself, right? And that's really where a lot of problems in the world come from, is from people having this selfish, empathetic response to things and insisting that other people need to do it. And it's the same thing with the vaccine thing. I'm not even going to get into that, but you know what I'm talking about. People who become empathetic towards people and start enforcing ideas down people's throats. And if you don't accept the idea, then they can't empathize with you. And if they can't empathize with you, then they dehumanize you, and they just want you to die, so that you aren't a part of their life or whatever. It's entirely selfish. It's an entirely selfish experience. And I think this idolization we have towards empathy is just silly. Like, it's not something to celebrate. I don't think it's something to cast shame upon necessarily. But it's just something that exists as part of being a human being. And that's it. Like, you don't have to celebrate it. And I don't think it's helpful to act upon empathy, because, like I said, I've been drilling this point in, is that making decisions based off of an emotional response doesn't usually lead to a beneficial outcome, because you're not thinking critically, you're not thinking objectively, you're making decisions based off emotions. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can be with you forever. And I will see you next time. Peace.